Dr. Lisa Delpit, Teaching When the World is on Fire. 99 Pages is a community committed to reading and discussing 99 pages of a book every week. We as educators, sometimes our job can be lonely. Sometimes it can be isolating. It's nice to get in a room, virtual or otherwise, with other adults who share our passions and share our commitment to this practice. We love a little Socratic dialogue, a little lifelong learning. So thank you for joining us. Want to let you know we're here every week at this time. So as Dan says, smash that subscribe button on YouTube so you can get notifications and join us. Next week, we're actually not going to be on YouTube. We're going to have a town hall discussion so that we can have breakout rooms where everybody is talking about topics in this book. So if you want to join next week, we'll be at edu.99pagesclub.com. That's where you'll get the private Zoom link to be able to join next Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Pacific. We read one book every month. So heads up, as talked about last week, next month, we are reading about coaching. Coaching is applied to educators. It'll also apply to ourselves, whether you are a coach or whether you want to think about self-coaching. This is an incredible book about resilience, but about many things. It's by Elena Aguilar. So check it out at your local library, your local bookstore, or that unnamed tech giant that will send it to you in 2 days. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and intro our panels. There's an essay in the third section of this book that talks about diverse literature. And the author of that essay, Noah Cho, said that when he was in school, there weren't any books or authors that he connected to, where he saw so little of himself in the books he read as an Asian American. So panelists, for introductions this week, I'm going to ask you to share a book that you read as a student or an educator that really spoke to you and why. So to get started, we have literacy coach and teacher coach extraordinaire, my friend, former English teacher based in Baltimore, Kendra Gray.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you everyone for coming back for the third edition of 99 Pages. Really excited again to be a part of this experience. A book that definitely shaped my experience growing up was Toni Morrison's Sula. And in 10th or around 11th grade, for one of those AP English classes, my teacher used some of our students' complaints about the book to kind of highlight the fact that as a culture, we have very diverse people, and part of being a member of Black culture is having this diverse language, because long story made short, my classmates were making fun of the dialect that Toni Morrison so beautifully crafted in Sula. And I started to feel a bit singled out because the dialect mirrored some of the dialect that I hear in my family. And so I really personally connected with that book, not just because Toni Morrison is, Toni Morrison, but also because that was one moment where I remember a teacher really stood up for me. And it helped me with feeling more comfortable with who I was while exploring my Black identity as a student in a school where I definitely wasn't part of the majority. So it would have to be Sula.
Thank you so much, Kendra. As a white woman in education, all I read was about white people. And so I didn't have that experience. And I love hearing from my friends of color what books of color I should have put in the curriculum and in my English classroom. So thank you for sharing. Next up, we have my friend, 17-year educator, 8th grade math teacher coming to us from New Rochelle, New York, Dan Kelly.
All right. Thank you, Jackie. I'm super excited for another evening spent with you guys. I'm gonna go a little bit obscure here. So one of the first books that I felt like I could really relate to spoke to me because it was featuring this sort of nerdy, quiet guy who a guy who tried to have a good heart, of course, all the time, but a guy who actually made some mistakes. And, in trying to wrestle with those mistakes, he was trying to learn to become a better person. And he indeed learned the lesson that, in fact, as he became a better person and he gained new power, with that power came great responsibility. And so, of course, I'm talking about the gateway drug to all books, which is comic books. Spider-Man, actually, very early on, I was just reading everything and getting back catalogs and just absorbing the stories. And I felt like it spoke to me, which is wonderful. But what has been really, really nice to see as the Marvel universe has evolved is to see that like now we have Miles Morales and we have Gwen Stacy and we have all these other spider people, as in the Into the Spider-Verse movie she's shown. Just like it's not enough to just have a like white young man as the leader in a comic book. Like you need to do better than that. You need to be more inclusive than that. So I'm really happy to see all these different takes on this classic character who just tries to do the right thing. Thank you, Jackie.
Yeah, knowing you personally, if you hadn't talked about Marvel, I would have been very disappointed. So
I never disappoint you, Jackie.
Next up, we have my friend Zachariah Sherbini, a master early childhood educator and school leader, coming to us from Baltimore, Maryland. Thank you, Zachariah.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be back with you for this last session. So I will say that growing up, I strongly did not identify as a reader. And I was really bored by what I had to read in English class. I did it because we had to do it. I'm certain if I had had a teacher like Judy Bello, I would have loved reading and would have loved literary analysis. It's honestly not. So as a result, I just read a lot of nonfiction for years and years and years. And 2 years ago, I asked a friend who was an English major, loves reading. I said, I need to read some fiction. Like, what can you recommend? And so this was neither as a student nor a teacher in class, but the book that he recommended that I then loved was The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. And there were a few different things that I liked about it. One is that it wove in real aspects of Dominican history. It took place both in American culture, a culture that I could understand, but then also in a Dominican setting. So I was learning about other cultures at the time, and there was just a grittiness to the storyline that I could appreciate. It didn't, and without giving anything away, it didn't wrap up neatly. And I just thought that there was something about that reflects real life sometimes, where you might have a typical story arc, but then the way it ends might be a little bit unexpected. So it wasn't honestly until a couple of years ago that I started to come around to fiction reading and just for the first time realized that there was such great depth in a fiction world.
Thank you, Zachariah. As an English teacher, I always love finding out who wasn't a passionate reader early on and how they came to reading, because I always want to evangelize this religion of reading. And that's one of the key tenets and goals of 99 Pages. How do we get more people excited about reading? And usually it's like, at the beginning, if someone turned you off, it's because they just didn't find the right text. They didn't introduce you to Spider-Man, or Toni Morrison, or whatever that gateway drug could be for you. Next up, I'm super excited to introduce Laurel Staub, a learning experience design master and leader of both students and adults. Thank you, Laurel.
Thank you, Jackie. Really excited to be here for the last night with us together. And looking forward to our conversation. When you sent out this question beforehand, I struggled to come up with a book, even though I do think of myself as an avid reader and someone who's always loved reading. I struggled to find a book that I read in school that made an impact on me that I could still recall. So that I think is telling in some ways about the kind of standard English curriculum, even for a white student, that there just wasn't a lot that I connected with. There's more a lot of things that I feel like I had to read. So I just am picking my favorite book, hands down, and it's called How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America. It's by an author named Kiese Lehman, who I actually know because he was a professor at my undergraduate college. And although I didn't have him as a teacher, unfortunately, I knew about him because he was a writing professor. And it's a collection of essays, so it is nonfiction, which I love. I love both fiction and nonfiction, but I really love this book because it makes me cry and it makes me laugh multiple times. The way that he writes with such kind of nuance and humor, and he just kind of drops brutal truths about America and his experience and how he's lived that I really resonate with, very much so. And so I just really love and recommend that book, and that's what I'm sharing.
Thank you, Laurel. I feel like I just need a recommendation from you, and because if every book you've read comes with that kind of like stellar intro, like I am in, count me in. And last but not least, our humble, amazing Michael Block from Humboldt, Texas, Teacher of the Year, middle school English teacher extraordinary. You know that English teachers have a special place in my heart. Give it up for Michael Block.
Thank you for having me back again. So very honored, and I love the conversation. The book I chose was Lies My Teacher Told Me by Lowen, and it's actually referenced in the introduction of Teaching While the World's on Fire. It was given to me by my high school teacher and mentor as a graduation gift, and I grew up in a pretty conservative area, and I was myself very conservative in high school. And religious. And when I read that book, that was a thread on like the sweater of my worldview that like once I started tugging on that, a lot of things unraveled and my eyes opened a lot. We talked about history being taught from a white male perspective, and here was, revealing the truth about Christopher Columbus and talking about Thanksgiving through a Native American's eyes. And it was just, for me at the time, exactly what I needed to hear. And then it led to so many other things.
Thank you so much, Michael. Can everybody write that down? A thread on the sweater of my worldview? Like, what do you talk like that?
All right.
Poet.
Beautiful rhetoric.
Awesome. All right, let's get into the book. We finished the book this week. A lot of this book has been about creating inclusive classrooms. One thing from section 2 we didn't get to spend enough time with last week that I want to start with was about how can we better support LGBTQ plus students and adults in schools today. I'd like to go ahead and start with Dan, if you're open to talking about this.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So there are a ton of ways to do it, and honestly, we can talk about super big ways to engage, but I actually think the little things count a ton as well. And so, anytime you find a way to acknowledge people, people love being acknowledged. People love feeling heard and seen and feeling present. And, as soon as I ever walk into a room that has been designated as my classroom, I put up my action figures, my Spider-Man, all the things, all the posters, but I also make sure I put like the little yellow equality symbol on a blue sign, the pride flag. I'll make that present in my room somewhere. And even when I started with little gestures like that, the number of times somebody would come up to me at some point, either on the first day of school or on the 10th day of school or on the last day of school, and say, like, Mr. Kelly, like I always loved that you had that thing there that made me feel welcome and made me feel part of the class. Or even if you're just doing word problems or word puzzles in my class, and you just don't make everyone a he or a she, just talk about like, oh, they are doing this other thing. And little things like that can go such a long way to making people feel included. And there's no reason why everyone can't do some gesture to make all people feel welcome in their rooms.
Thank you so much, Dan. Anybody else want to add more?
I just want to jump on that real fast because I love that idea of having it be visible and ever present, right? That's so important. In my class, I'm just so much more subtle about it, and I shouldn't be. But I can't tell you how many students, because I have been able to create some kind of atmosphere of safety and trust that have come to me after class and said, "Hey, I can't come out to my dad because of this or X reason or whatever," and to have me be that person that they felt comfortable to come talk to, it's something important that we all have to be able to offer our students, I think. And it's just, I don't know, it's happened so many times over the course of my career. I shudder to think how often those students didn't feel welcome or safe in other classrooms or spaces.
Michael, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering, like, I love that you can be that kind of person that people will come to you and share that. What are some of the preceding elements you think that lead someone to get there?
I don't know. I want to say humor, like to be quite honest, and to be fair about so many different things, and to show that you're willing to engage multiple perspectives about things. I need to maybe do some more thinking about that, because I should be able to point to something and say, oh, this is what I do, like the way Dan can, right? He something that's ever present and demonstrable.
Michael, you just need to exude approachability, which is exactly what you do.
Okay.
So as long as you do that, you're good.
Okay, yeah. So
No.
that's it. That's what he said.
Yeah.
I want to jump in. I want to add, for students and alike, adults alike, one of the things that occurred this summer when I was on an interview panel with some of my colleagues on our leadership team, we were being introduced to new potential teachers, and I would lead the panel with, hi, I'm Kendra. Would you please introduce yourself and also say your pronouns? And the amount of people on our panel who were kind of blown away by just that insertion of the question, like, what are your pronouns? And the fact that I modeled it first, definitely, set the tone for our team being inclusive. And also, I got a lot of feedback from my colleagues one-to-one that was the first time they heard something like that, or wow, what made me think about doing that? And so it does take one person, to my colleague's point, like you could be that person to just isolate the strategy and start really hitting it home. And then once the adults do it, then it trickles down to the students. But you really do want to be able to be that person to say, I did something, like maybe you can't really pinpoint right now, but it definitely goes in waves. And now, I'm pretty sure that when my school leadership team are introducing themselves to new people, they think about that moment when I, boldly said, and what are your pronouns? Something that honestly, I don't think twice about, but for others, it could be something very profound that just produces a lot more inclusivity for all.
Thank you, Kendra. I mean, the importance of modeling and creating space so someone doesn't have to volunteer their pronouns. It's just a norm. It's just part of how we introduce ourselves. I'm seeing it more and more in meetings. I love it that people in their Zoom name are doing it as well. So thank you for sharing. So that was from section 2. A big part of section 3, which was what we read in this past week, was actually about issues related to talking about climate justice with students. So personally, in 2019, I felt like I saw a lot of student activism around environmental activism across the globe. And I feel like it's taken a back seat in 2020, partly due to the pandemic, partly because of a much needed focus on racial justice. So I'm just curious for all of you, can you tell me what you're seeing on the ground today, teaching and advocating about the climate crisis?
Sure, I can jump in here. At my school that I teach at African Leadership University, we actually have in one of our degrees that we offer called Global Challenges, there is a whole track related to climate change and wildlife conservation as well. So students who choose to focus on that for their degree get to learn quite a bit about this. But I'd like to say that I think in reaction to what you were saying, actually, Jackie, about like how this year there hasn't been as much of a focus on it because there's a focus on racial justice, that actually climate justice and racial justice go hand in hand. And so thinking about, my students and their experiences on the continent of Africa, climate change is already here and it's real and it's having impacts on the environment. It's having impacts on farming. It's having impacts on rainfall. So like they already see that and live that. So it's a very real experience that they then want to do something about and feel kind of empowered to take action on, to build projects and to do things. So I think that is something that you can think about in terms of who gets impacted by climate change first, thinking about your students and their lived experiences and how they might have seen these impacts already, and then implementing or creating kind of projects around that in order to teach about the topic.
Thank you, Laurel. Anyone else?
Well, living in Houston, we've gone through several major hurricanes recently, right? Like Harvey was the big one. And I don't want to typecast Houston as over-conservative. I mean, we think Texas, we think very conservative and for good reason, but Houston's quite an amalgam because people come from all over to specifically work in the oil and gas industry, right? And so it's just this really complex thing where there's this culture of denying climate change and all that for a long time that's kind of deeply rooted. And on top of that, you have populations moving in that are from all over the country, myself included. I'm from Ohio. And so they're bringing in their understanding of climate knowledge. And it's just, there's so many places where it's butting heads. And in the midst of all that, like we're experiencing catastrophic hurricanes like left and right. We had one just a month ago where it didn't hit us. It hit Louisiana, unfortunately, for for Louisiana, but we canceled school for 2 days because of the threat of it. You know, I mean, that's where we're at here. We've had our schools flood, we've had our neighborhoods flood, we've had neighbors saving each other on boats, like all the things you've seen in the news. And it's maddening because we still have science teachers at my school who deny climate change, and it's just like, you know, what do you do? You know, and what you do is you state it, like Laurel said, it's a fact, it's happening. Here's evidence. Remember last week? You know, like it's a thing. It just needs to be stated, and I guess stated firmly.
For those who haven't read the book that are joining us, there is an essay all about how to teach, particularly in a community that doesn't buy in, and I thought it was a thoughtful essay. Great. Let's now move on. I love pulling us actually into the book, and so I'm going to go to a quote on page 191. One of the things, this book is a lot about encouraging student activism as a way to fight so many types of injustice. And on page 191, author Bill Bigelow writes, "Falling into cynicism is a hazard one confronts simply by living in our society with its inequality, violence, and lack of democracy." So my question for the panel is, how do we open students' eyes to the horrible realities of this broken world that's on fire, while still inspiring hope and mobilizing for change? I think this is really hard. Daniel, you're up.
Put me in, coach. All right, so we talked about this a little bit before we went live, and because this is a question that came up, and I did a lot of thinking on it, and every time I thought about it, I got emotional for lots of reasons, which I will be sharing momentarily. So if you bear with me, I want to take you on a little journey. Balancing optimism with realism, balancing hope with concern is really hard. Taking you on this journey for a little bit, if you imagine a scenario where at a middle school commencement graduation ceremony, a math teacher walks up to a kid with their parents with one of those little like seashell turtles that you might get on a trip to the beach, and presents it to the kid and the family and says, "This is the turtle of courage that you earned." And that's the first time the student or the parents ever hear about a turtle of courage. It has almost no meaning. Now, the best teachers in the world can like inject meaning into it at the moment and make it powerful. But if you, on day 7 of 180 days with your students, you start mentioning the fact, dropping little breadcrumbs and seeds, that at the end of the year, you're going to present, and you show the students this little turtle of courage. You're going to present it to one kid in front of their family on the day of commencement, and you're going to tell the parents or the family, whoever they may be, of that kid, what they did to earn that turtle of courage. And you tell the students on day 7 that like it's never happened, and the parents and the kid, and maybe even me, haven't cried during it. Then all of a sudden you give time for that to grow. Anytime you teach and you sort of pre-teach something, so that by the time it comes up, you've already planted that seed, you're adding power to it. And so that's what I do. But on top of that, I also start planting seeds about the last day lecture, which is the last day of school. I think in a previous one of these conversations, I've talked about how it's so important to let the kids see the joy that you have as a teacher. It's so important that the kids walk out feeling like that teacher wants to be in that room with us. And so hopefully the kids get that impression from me. But what I start talking about is how the last day of the year, though I'm so proud of everything my students have accomplished, it's personally the most difficult day, because it's the day where we say goodbye. So the last day lecture is a day where we sort of break down all barriers about math, and we talk about more important things, even more important things. And we talk about the journeys that the kids are going to go on and the things that they will discover, and some life lessons that I've tried to sort of provide them with throughout the year, culminating in this last day lecture, where on slide 35 or something like that, there's a slide that talks about, hey, you kids are about to enter a world where there are so many problems. The world is on fire, right? And I just list all of the things from racism to sexism to all of the environmental issues Michael was just talking about are all on the board. And I take a moment to just let them look at that. And nothing is new. It's not like I'm just hitting them that for the first time. Like, we've talked about all those things throughout the year. And as they're looking at it and it's quiet, I say, despite all of the things that are going on in the world that make me fearful, that make me concerned, there's some reason why I'm actually very hopeful about the future. There's something that gives me a feeling that there's going to be a reason to be hopeful. And so you have to ask yourself as kids, like, what could make a teacher like me so hopeful about a world with so many things wrong in it? What's so powerful that it could possibly change the world? And then I click on my little clicker, and then on the next slide, all of those scary and important big words collapse. And the only word that's written there, the only thing that gives me hope because it's powerful enough, is just the word you. And in that moment, I look at all my students and I try to make eye contact with all of them, but it's pretty challenging because I'm crying and they're crying too. And as I tell this story now, I think about, like, I didn't get to do that last year. You know, I didn't get to say goodbye to my kids in person. And that was hard. You know, we did something like that remotely, but it didn't have the same weight. And I think it's so important that we address these issues and connect, as Jackie said in this question, like, the powerful and important and scary, daunting challenges that are out there. We can't hide our kids. We shouldn't hide them from our kids, but we need to connect them to the fact that there are reasons to have hope. And that is foundational, is what we do as teachers.
Everybody's just getting some stats. Dan, I feel you so much to have started with students and then for them to have left. But I get chills just thinking about the you slide. One thing students have to know, these bad policies and inequitable racist systems of oppression were put in place by humans, and they can be overhauled and changed by humans. And no one is better to do this than students themselves. Also excited about the changing demographics of our country. I think there's a lot of exciting change ahead. So thank you for sharing so vulnerably, Dan. You always bring your full self and your actual classroom strategies and experience to these conversations, and I appreciate it. Anybody, I know that's a tough act to follow. Anybody just want to piggyback on that?
I'll jump in and I'll change it up a little bit, but I'm gonna bring it back around. So when I first moved to Baltimore a couple of years ago, I had hopped between a few different cities over the previous few years, invested a lot in career, and I looked at my personal life and I realized that I needed a hobby. I needed something that had nothing to do with work, that had nothing to do with intellectual engagement. And so, living on my own, I wanted to take care of houseplants. And I'd always been really nervous about it because I'd never been able to keep any plants alive, but determined to do it, I went to the IKEA and I picked up 3 plants and I put them in the car while I picked something else up. And by the time I got back to the car, they were burnt to a crisp. And I say this because I went back and I got more plants and I brought them back home. And those plants were the first of a collection of probably 35 or 40 that I have in my apartment now, because they taught me something really, really important that was unexpected. Plants, and I'm going to suggest that plants don't just belong in homes, but I think that they have a really important place in school and in classrooms because they teach us a lot about life. To take care of a plant well and have it grow and have it stay with you, it needs dedication. It needs the right conditions. It needs collective care and checking in. And there's something that I appreciate about them especially, which is that they grow really slowly. And I think they're a really important antidote for an instant gratification culture that many of us do engage with simply because our world moves at faster and faster speeds. And so I think having something in your classroom that students either are caring for or at the very least are witnessing the slow growth of is a really great reminder that anything worth caring for takes time and takes dedication. And without those two things, you won't see the success, but they're also really giving in terms of how they can nurture and sustain you. And so I think plants was my first response, which I know is a little bit unexpected, but just having those in the classroom, it's appropriate for kids of all ages, really. The second direction that I'll go in this is quite simply games and laughter and fun and injecting some lightness into what can be a really heavy world. It is, but I think it is heavy, but I think it points to what is my word of 2020, which is perspective. I've had to really remind myself of perspective in many functions, both of various privileges that I may hold at this time, and also as it relates to this kind of book, the scope of my own influence. When the world is on fire, and there are all of these different massive concerns that are affecting us collectively, we also need to be aware of how we plug into certain material and certain content. As I sort of take a longer historical look at the world and problems that the world has experienced, there have always been really bad things happening, actually. There have been really good things happening too, but there have been really bad things happening. And I think the fact that we can now be aware of all of it at the same time, I think that is one of the most powerful weights. That's a really dramatic shift. 20, 30 years ago, before the proliferation of the internet and subsequent technological advances, people may plug into the news for half an hour, an evening, or read the newspaper in the morning. But now we are getting the perspective of potentially everyone in the world, not literally, but billions of people, things that are affecting people all over the globe. And we are getting it on our phones, and we're getting it as part of a streamlined consciousness that we can't help. I should speak from my perspective. I can't help sometimes but feel overwhelmed by all of it. And so keeping some perspective, selectively tuning in, not as a matter of sort of creating or reinforcing your own worldview, but being really thoughtful in terms of the frequency of how you engage with these kinds of issues. And then as we wrap it up for our students, defining a scope, recognizing that with all of these issues going on in the world, what are the limitations of your energy and resources, but also what are the power of those things as well, and being able to point to past successes, either individual successes within the classroom where you're trying to remind a kid about their own ability to persevere and learn and grow, or looking historically at some of those major problems that have happened in the past. Humanity has solved those things. Sometimes, not necessarily collectively, but there are a lot of challenges and major issues in the past that people have solved. And so I think recognizing that ingenuity that is a part of the human spirit, recognizing that does not know any bounds in terms of time or place, and then focusing your efforts a little bit, I think it can actually increase the hope in the face of so many problems. So I think I took us all over the place, but that's where I'm going to end.
And Zachariah, I mean, drop mic. I mean, I'm just so inspired. I feel like I have my roadmap for the future, which is like hope, plants, games, aka levity, and of course, always getting perspective. Does anybody else want to just piggyback on anything that they said?
Real fast, with what Zachariah was saying about just having that historical perspective. One of the things I do in my classroom is I have the hero wall. And one of the things I say to my students a lot is everyone needs to have some words to live by, and everyone needs to have a role model to follow. And so I make it a point, I try to guide it a little bit, because there's a lot of important people in history that students just have no idea who they are. But my list tries to be inclusive of, people who are living, dead, young, old, white, black, brown, from people who are disabled, people who are gay, straight, people from all kinds of different fields, politics, scientists, athletes, just anybody who has some kind of trait that or overcame some kind of very serious obstacle when their world was on fire. And and trying to actually get the kids to draw something out that they can use for themselves. So they find a picture of that person and they write just a few responses to, like, what is something that this person did and what does it mean to you? And we put that on the wall, and that wall is it's the whole wall of a classroom. So it's the first thing they see when they come into the room. Also, it's like strategically placed to be like, this is what we're aspiring to.
Michael, can you say that again? You said everyone needs
some words to live by. So like a quote, and so something like when you're feeling really overwhelmed, that you can just return to those words, like a mantra, if you will, and a role model to follow.
Yeah, and I know that. I
And
just want you to say it again.
Yours
I
is
love
Spider-Man.
I love it.
Great power comes great responsibility.
Spider-Man and David Wright, yes.
but it matters to you, right? Like in the times in your life, Dan, where you were down, that was something that you could lean on in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Thank you, panelists. As an English teacher, one way to engage with the text is not just appreciation, but we also want to model to our students critical thinking. And one way to be critical is to show some constructive criticism. So I thought we'd open up, since we finished the book this week, to talk about our critiques of this book. I'll throw one out there to start with. This book is a lot about creative, inclusive classrooms, and yet it espouses a very liberal political ideology that I think would alienate some conservative readers. I'm curious, did anybody else feel this tension?
I felt the tension, and I wanted to feel more of it. So this is maybe not a great critique, except that it's so important to speak the truth. And what we have in our country right now, and this is my opinion, and I'm sorry if I'm alienating somebody now, but there used to maybe be a middle in this country. I'm actually not so sure, but there used to be some kind of middle, and there are some of us who have gone very far in one direction, and it's important to recognize how big the crazy has become in our country. There was the poll taken recently that 50% or so of Trump supporters believe in the QAnon conspiracy, for example, and so we're far beyond a normal political debate when we're dealing with that massive of a number, with that big of a misinformation, of an untruth, and that's just one of like so many examples. I mean, we could go to not wearing masks or believing COVID is a hoax, and just on it goes. And one of the things I worry about is having some kind of false equivalency and saying that, both sides are equal. Let's hear them both out, when one side is saying 2 + 2 = 4, and one is saying 2 + 2 = potato or something. It's like, it's really the discourse needs to be honed in on something. I mean, I would challenge anybody to read this book and say that there's something factually inaccurate that's been presented in one of these essays. And so I think that I think people need to be more firmer in their convictions when they're speaking the truth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Nice. I have some thoughts on this in terms of reaction to the book and how we think about just kind of like politics and education, right? So you call it liberal, but I actually didn't find this book particularly liberal. I found it much more rooted in kind of progressive education and even critical pedagogy, which is definitely an ideological bent, but admits that it is so. So it's very intentionally saying that this has an agenda. And that's what critical pedagogy has taught me, is being okay with knowing that we have an agenda and we have an ideology, but that agenda and ideology that each of us has, that we're bringing as educators or as students or anyone who's coming into an education space, is rooted in our own realities, right? And so I think what I got from this book that's most important is that we make space for climates and cultures for us to engage with those different realities that students are coming from, and they have, and making inclusive spaces where students feel comfortable sharing ideas like that. Like, one of the questions that I love to ask both my teachers that I teach and my students that I teach is, as a teacher, is it okay to share your opinion? And I always get great responses, but I have my own ideas about this, about whether I should share my opinion or not with students, and when not, it's okay. But I think that we do a disservice if we pretend that there is some kind of neutral, or that there is some kind of not taking a stance, because there's always going to be some kind of political opinion underlying whatever it is, whether you think that the 1619 project is propaganda, as our president espouses, or you think that what he's putting forth in terms of, I don't know what, but some other kind of like ideology about or mythology about the history of our country is political, right? Both of those are going to be political projects. And so we need to admit that neither are neutral. And so I think that's very important. I think about I've had lots of experiences as a student as well, where I had teachers who shared their opinion where I think they shouldn't have. Like I remember when I was in 6th grade, I had a science teacher who we read an article from like a magazine every week, which was great. It was like a current events article, but there was an article on not vaccinations, but needle distribution. So there's this article about how they were distributing needles in inner cities for those who are addicted to drugs to prevent HIV transmission. And the teacher shared her opinion right away, saying this was a waste of money because that type of population, like they're not going to like take care of themselves anyways. Like it's, like why would you do that? And I remember like every single student in the class like raising their hand and saying exactly what she did, just being like, wow, okay. And I remember also having that voice in my head being like, what if just one person is saved by this project? Wouldn't even that one life be worth it? Even like, who's to say what a waste of money is, right? But I didn't share that with the rest of the class. But I remember having that experience as a student. So I remember as a teacher being like, I want to be a teacher who creates a climate where students who had that little voice in their head feel comfortable sharing it, right? And I remember when I was teaching in 7th grade, we had a conversation about end of life decisions, and I was teaching in South Texas, and I had several students kind of raise their hands and share their opinion about how at the end of people's lives they should be able to make a choice for themselves, and they were kind of sharing things that I somewhat personally agreed with, and I was like, okay. And then I had a student who raised his hand and said, actually, like my faith teaches me something else, and this is what I believe, and who was able to do that. And so then I did pat myself in the back a little bit because I was like, okay, I did something where he felt comfortable sharing that. And so I think that's what we want to really push for, is creating those climates and those atmospheres where we're getting students to think critically and they can share themselves and their own experiences. But with that dialogue that they have with each other, they're expanding their worldviews, they're learning more. So how we approach it is really important as well.
Thank you, Laurel. I asked a question in the chat based on what you said, which is essentially,
I missed it.
When do we think it's okay? And Kendra, do you want to jump in? I saw that you responded.
Yeah, I think that, one thing that teachers would have to model, I can imagine, is being able to create the conditions that it's okay to disagree with this mystical creature that is your teacher. One thing that I try to push to my teachers a lot is that you are the facilitator of learning, but you don't have all the keys. And that's kind of part of Dr. Beverly Tatum's theory on CRP, culturally responsive pedagogy, is that the students make just as much meaning of the classroom and the content and what's around the world around them as the teacher. And so the teacher is not, the person who is enforcing all of these one-way thoughts and ideologies. And so first, the teacher has to model that it's okay to encourage discourse in that way and, not get flustered or offended, and actually show students what it is like to have evidence to support an opinion. And then just to touch on Michael's point, it just continues to resonate with me that there is truth. Truth didn't just fly out of the window over the course of the last few years. Although it may seem that way, there is still something called the truth. Maybe I'm old-fashioned in thinking that, but yes, just continuing to lift up the fact that such thing as reality and truth. And then I just continue to think about students who are students in urban environments, and their truth is in front of them all the time. There is no, maybe I'm not that poor, or maybe I'm not that Black today. It's very much in front of them. So I think as educators, it's not worth trying to hide or, not making space for those types of conversations to come up, because it doesn't serve students well at all.
Yeah, totally.
I might add in, thank you. Yes. And when teachers are working so hard to deliberately stay neutral, then what that means is the loudest voice shouting in the outside kind of wins, right? Neutrality, it isn't really achievable, because all it means is you're just working with the momentum of whoever the loud voice is. And something I think we all need to think about, as a society, as people who are developing curriculum and shaping how teachers teach. For a long time, there's been this emphasis, stay neutral, stay neutral, stay neutral, with, I guess, the hope that kids will just learn on their own as they grow up how to fact check, develop opinions, cite evidence to back those opinions up, and develop philosophies that the world considers to be healthy. You know, like, it's just, to me, so funny. Like, we don't just assume kids will learn quadratic equations on their own, but by failing to teach kids how to develop opinions, we are just hoping that kids learn how to develop healthy opinions on their own. You know, I mean, if educators aren't going to do that, then what are we doing here? You know, not that it's easy. It's not. It's really, really hard and awkward. And also, like, for every teacher out there that, you know, maybe like-minded with some of the people on this chat and this chat on the side, wherever you are, like, there are other teachers out there, like a teacher that Michael referenced before, where, like, I don't know if I really want that teacher to be like, cool, I can just share my opinions, yay. You know, so you know, it's not easy, but I do think that we need to engage with it rather than just hope it works itself out while we pretend to be neutral.
Yeah, and I'll throw in an anecdote from grad school. I remember I was taking a class on adult development from pretty much the person who had developed the framework for it. He had been teaching for 40 years, and he was very much like that celebrity status, sort of mic dropper. Everything he said was so important. He was doing his rounds through discussion sections one day and popped into our class, and we were learning part of the methodology behind you know, engaging with another adult. That's the sort of the short version. And you know, he popped in and said, "Any questions?" And someone said, "Well, yeah, in such and such part, I'm not sure how to do that without sounding judgmental." And he said, "Who says you shouldn't be judgmental?" And I'm not saying that I agree with that in every single setting, but it resonated with me because I think there are appropriate times to be judgmental. For instance, you know, going back to what Kendra was saying, you know, there is still such a thing as truth, and I think we're seeing a recognition that there has been perhaps too much neutrality, too much silence, too much politeness, and as Dan, I believe, said, the loudest voice or voices are sort of winning out and influencing people. And I think there ought to be judgment on something like that. And for Lisa Delpit, I imagine, and it, you know, it's been a few weeks since I've gone back and read the introduction, so I don't recall exactly, but like, there was a reason that she put this together. And one thing you know from working with people, whether you are a teacher or a school leader, or you work with families or students in other capacities, you're not going to please everyone. And it is a fool's errand to try to please everyone. The fact that some of these issues are being politicized does not make them political issues in and of themselves. They are important, impactful issues that are playing out right now. And I think if we defer to politeness or defer to you know, letting everyone sort of have their own facts rather than opinions, I think we get in some murky water.
Can I answer one of the questions in the chat, or speak to one of the questions in the chat? Yeah, so
pull it up here.
Sorry.
Basically, just what happens when a student's point of view harms the safety of another student? Thank you, Alyssa Baylor.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I take a hard line on this. This is one where I will share my opinion freely and very quickly, right? Because this is one of those, this is one of those things where if a student expresses an opinion, because I strongly believe that not all ideas are equal, all people are, but all ideas are not, right? And I'm not going to pretend that I think that some things are okay, or like, oh, we have different beliefs about whether someone has a right to exist or their identity is real. No, especially not if it's one of my students in my class who might be sitting there and feeling like they have been personally attacked, right? So it's something that actually have worked with Alyssa to coach teachers on, is like, what do we do when a student shares something that is a hurtful or hateful statement towards another student, right? And I think that it is our responsibility as educators to stand up for our most vulnerable students always. And so to immediately kind of address the fact that something happened that caused harm and that it was harmful, but also do it in a way that doesn't necessarily shame the student who might have said something, right? So like you can still say that something is absolutely unacceptable and that it can cause a lot of harm without necessarily trying to really like shun or alienate that other student. But if that has to be done in defense of the most vulnerable student, I will also make that stand. But I'd love to hear what other people's thoughts are on that as well and how they've handled it. It's something that we role play a lot with teacher education is like, what do you do? Because I think doing nothing is not acceptable in my mind.
Acceptable. Totally right. I was that student that in classroom discussions said offensive things because of my background, right? Like where the particular way that I had been raised. And that story that was in this, the essay about the girl who, in Ohio of all places, staunchly denied the climate science that her teacher was trying to espouse. It's so important that that student got to speak. That's actually very, very good. It might have, there might be a temporary hurt that needs to be remedied and addressed, but that student, now that they've put that out there, has to grapple with the fact that they put that out there, or at least I did. And that's how, I've come to a lot of enlightenment, I'd like to think, in my life, because I put a lot of ideas out there that I didn't have a leg to stand on. And it was only when those ideas were challenged that I was able to pull it back a little bit. Those students might not realize they're actually hurting anybody. That's the thing.
Right.
And once they realize that, then there's like, oh, wait a minute, and they might not have a cruel intention. Now they might have a cruel intention. That's a different thing. But in my experience, anyway, it's usually misinformation or repeating something that they've heard or something like that. And then when you bring that to the surface, the light can disinfect that. I'm very metaphorical tonight. I'm sorry.
We got some good metaphors going on.
I think like Laura, that quote, right? Like people are equal, but not all ideas are, right? I think that when we start defending the right for opinions to be brought up in class and defending the right for teachers to voice their opinion when they highlight it as their opinion and they give the background context to help frame it, right? Then some people will take away from that, like, oh, all opinions are cool, so I don't like that kind of person. That's my opinion. I'm allowed to have it. Like, no, like, but to Laura's point, which I thought was so eloquently said, like, that doesn't mean the response is to immediately shame the person with the opinion that we're trying to change, because that's not going to be an effective strategy either. But there's a big difference between whether you like peppermint ice cream or vanilla ice cream, an opinion, versus like whether someone's life matters. Like it's and unfortunately we have a ton of people who are intentionally or unintentionally taking that like, oh, all opinions are okay, cool, I'm gonna say my opinion no matter how hurtful it is. And yeah, that's the nuance that is teaching and the nuance that is engaging in our society for sure.
Thank you. I want to create space in case, again, in our last few minutes, there were other critiques of the book. Again, I think it's so important to engage in that way with what we read.
I have some, mainly the first one, and we talked about this offline a bit, but I think about new teachers a lot. I coach a lot of new teachers, and for a new teacher to read this book, I have to echo the words of Dr. Sonia St. Solisas, the CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, which she said at the beginning of the school year to new teachers, which is get good first. Like the sentiments of this book are definitely ones that can transform the lives of students. However, your priority first, of course, is to do no harm to students. You want them to, stay alive while in your care. But then the second thing is just be really good at teaching. And focus on building a classroom that is a safe space for students. Now, of course, the book talks about how to do this, but new teachers, I could just see the overwhelm that could spiral out of their lovely, precious brains and impressionable brains while reading this, and then going into the classroom a day after a teacher reads this and seeing like all of the things that they've tried to change at once. And then it takes time to be able to feel confident in executing some of these things that the book definitely talks about. And then the other critique that I have is that some of the stories obviously are from school systems that have a lot more resources or students who might not be as diverse or vice versa. So just keeping that in mind that, this is not like a one size fits all approach, and that consider the voices that aren't being heard and the stories that aren't being told.
I got one more time for one more critique. If anybody wants to throw it out there, throw that Molotov cocktail.
Oh boy.
I can. I'll be somewhat briefer. It sort of connects to this idea of implementation. And one of the things I think the book does really well is actually give tips for implementation for these individual ideas. But when you as an educator step back and recognize that all of these issues are happening simultaneously, how do you go about the process of choosing where you're going to engage? And I think just as importantly, where you're not going to engage. And so I had a chance to just write some stream of consciousness questions. I said, how do you decide what to implement? How do you take care of yourself as you do it? How do you reconcile your finite energy and influence with all the work that needs to or could be done? And then lastly, how do you consider your community? Because I think there are some issues that may be easier to address or better to start with because a community may have more receptivity. And so is it wise? I'm not saying it is or isn't, but is it wise to start with the most difficult topic or the project that might antagonize the most people? Or is there a little window of opportunity where you recognize, okay, some people are going to be a little bit miffed, but there's actually some opportunity and some infrastructure and some help from this community to start to do that work?
Thank you. Because we're in the last few minutes, I'd love to end with a wraparound. I think we have this book club because we care not just about theory, but application. How can people who tune into this broadcast and all of us kind of apply an idea from our book to our classroom tomorrow, to our practice this week? I'm a big believer of growth mindset, and I think real change comes in like small changes that you can implement every day. So let's just do a little wraparound. I'll go in the order of the panel. So Michael, I see you next to me. We'll just stay on this screen.
Absolutely.
Go for it.
I had so many fireworks and a facepalm moment when I was reading about how the students made their own little community, like, and pretended like they were the members of the community, like a city council or the mayor or just, concerned citizens. And they simulated like, what if, they wanted to build a factory here? I forget specifically, but like, how would you address, like, what issues does that bring to our town? Does that mean we're going to have to cut down trees in this park? Are we going to have to? I was like, that is so brilliant, because all of the stuff we're talking about can be very abstract, especially for a kid. And that brings that really down to home. Like, oh, here's an environmental issue because it's affecting the water in your neighborhood, in your hypothetical neighborhood. But it makes it more real. And I'm so going to steal that. I'm going to do that. That's for sure.
Laurel, you're up next.
This book definitely inspired me. We talked, I think, last week about co-teaching, or I typically think about call it co-creation. But yeah, it really inspired me to like go big and go home. Wait, that's not how you say it, but whatever. To really embrace co-creation as much as possible. So embrace that opportunity to allow students to design their own learning and make choices, and build things where they can do that. As much as possible, because yeah, time and time again, they prove, and this book proves, and just my experience has shown that when you give them those tools, then they flourish, and everybody is happier.
Thank you, Laurel. Zachariah, we're going a little clockwise.
Pick an issue that you care about and make a dent.
Love it. Always so succinct. All right, Kendra, you're up.
The final essay of this text about creating inclusive classrooms for Muslim children, it just really resonated with me. I taught in Abu Dhabi for 5 years, so all of my students, the majority of them identified as Muslim, and it just reminds me that it is up to the teacher to create the space for all students to feel included, and that regardless of their identity markers, it is still your responsibility to make sure they are included and feel included and feel comfortable.
Thank you. And Dan, close us up.
Sure. Page 85. And when you don't have the words and can't plan the lessons, don't just say nothing. Say exactly what you are feeling. That will mean more to your students than you may ever know. I think sometimes things happen and there's got to be a reaction, detention for 3 days. And like, when we are aggravated, when we're frustrated, when we're tired, when we're emotional, that's not when we make our best decisions. And some of the best advice I ever got as a teacher is that sometimes you don't know what the right consequence is, and say that. I'm not sure what the right thing to do here is, but I'm going to think about this, and we're going to talk about this, and we're going to find a way to make it better. And that can actually, again, lay the seed to be like, oh, well, this is going to be a bigger conversation than anything that can happen and end right now.
Incredible. Lead with vulnerability. I have learned so much from these 5 individuals. I want to let you know, if you've been watching and you're like, wait, I want to be a part of the discussion, we are having a town hall next week. That means it's a Zoom link below. Go to edu.99pagesclub.com this time next week. It will be closed books. So there's a little more privacy and vulnerability. It will not be live streamed on YouTube. We are just a community. We're going to have our own little Zoom and learn from each other, meet each other. So the names that I've only met through the chat, I want to meet you in real life. I want to talk about this book with you. And of course, this is the last of this panel-led book club on this incredible collection of essays, but it's not the end of 99 Pages EDU. We'll be talking about this book. Team, everybody hold up your book just so we can get one little last screenshot after the fact. Yeah. Okay, everybody who has joined us for this session or any session, thank you so much for being a part of our community. Again, this work can be very isolating, and we need to lean on each other and learn from each other. I've learned so much from this group. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.